This is the kind of story that will make your skin crawl. Deputies in New York say this man is a child predator who lured a 5-year-old girl with candy and then assaulted her.
You know, in life, what we find most valuable to us is our families, especially our children. And when we have an incident like this, it sure does raise the temperature of our tempers.
And what will make you even more mad is that deputies say this isn't the first time he's sexually assaulted a child this year, and he's been a convicted sex offender for more than a decade. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. What a man in central New York is accused of is the nightmare. A predator at a playground allegedly luring a victim, a young victim, just 5 years old, using candy. It is so blatant, it is so horrific that it's hard to believe, and deputies in central New York say this man was already a convicted sex offender. Before I get into the details of what Ryan Pontello is accused of, it's important to know that law enforcement is worried that he has more victims that they don't know about. Here are 3 of his mugshots that deputies in central New York have put out. All of them are related to arrests for sex crimes against children. Pontello's most recent arrest was on June 7th for what he allegedly did to a 5-year-old at a park near his apartment complex in the town of Clay, New York, near Syracuse. Here's the Onondaga County Sheriff.
This Pontello lured a 5-year-old girl from the playground with candy. He lured that 5-year-old girl into a wooded area and committed sex crimes. We were able to find and arrest Pontello yesterday and charge him for rape first, sex abuse first, luring a child. All those are felonies and endangering the welfare. As part of that investigation, we were able to also make an arrest on Pontello for an incident that happened earlier this year to a 3-year-old victim.
Deputies say Ryan Pontello has no previous relationship with the 5-year-old. His alleged victim was a random target. Not only is Pontello facing charges for the alleged sexual assault of a 5-year-old, you also heard deputies say they arrested him for a previous sex crimes case against a 3-year-old. And all we know about that is that deputies say Pontello sexually abused that victim in the same area as he allegedly did that 5-year-old girl who he reportedly lured with candy. Deputies say they found out about what happened because police were calling 911 at the park. The young victim told her friends, who then told their parents, who called the authorities. Before we get back to this story out of New York, I want to bring you a law and crime legal alert, because if you received a Depo-Provera birth control shot and were later diagnosed with a brain or a spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Our partners at Morgan & Morgan are investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It is free to check, takes just a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on your screen, click the link in the description, or go to www.forthepeople.com/LCDEPO to see if you qualify. I found Pontello's Facebook, and it appears that he has a girlfriend. And what is shocking in so many ways is that it appears he is a parent himself, a dad to a young teenager. According to Facebook, Pontello loves being a parent so much that he even got this tattoo with his son's name on it. We have blurred that young boy's name. Pontello is a convicted level 1 sex offender, and in New York, that categorizes someone as having low risk of reoffending, which certainly raises a lot of questions for the system and prosecutors in Oswego County, which is north of Syracuse. Right now, we know that Pontello became a sex offender after a 2011 incident involving a 5-year-old in Oswego County. Now, we don't know more because the DA who is prosecuting this current case in the Syracuse area said that Oswego County, where that incident took place in 2011, does not keep records for more than 10 years, but they are expecting to learn more information soon. The authorities were asked in this news conference if they believe Pontello has more victims, and this is what they said.
You know, the sheriff and I were just talking about that, the likelihood of, and just hypothetically, not directed towards Mr. Pontello, the likelihood of someone with those proclivities remaining dormant for a decade is extremely unlikely. So we're going to be doing a deep dive into his background, his location, see what evidence we get from his social media, from his phone, ping the phone, find out where he's been, et cetera, et cetera. There are a number of incidents, again, I shouldn't say a number. There's one incident that occurred where no suspect was developed, and he was not identified in a photo lineup, but the location and the MO are remarkably similar. And it's kind of a heartwarming thing, because that case, a sexual assault, was prevented by two youngsters who I think dived in to protect their brother from potentially being a victim. So it's important for you folks to get the word out there, not only his photo, but to constantly remind parents about, educating their kids about what's appropriate behavior, not appropriate, and then this luring of candy. A lot of times a dog is used as a prop. I lost my puppy, I lost my kitten, so forth and so on. No police officer is going to ask a child, unless it's an emergency situation, to come into his car or to take a kid into a remote area like that. So it's important that you folks get that word out.
It does appear that Pontello flew under the radar, even as a convicted sex offender. At multiple locations, the YMCA of Central New York sent out a notice in the wake of his arrest to members that a registered sex offender was a member of their Y. A spokesperson telling Syracuse.com that person is no longer a member. Now, even though they wouldn't outright say for some reason that Pontello was a member and that was who they were talking about, they did say that the member was involved in a recent incident in the same town as Pontello, and that they learned about what had happened through news reports. The Y says they use a third party to scan members to see if they're sex offenders, and apparently this one slipped through the cracks and the background check did not pick up that he was a convicted sex offender. Now, you also wonder, looking at Pontello's Facebook, as he goes to sporting events with his son and other things that you would see parents at, you certainly feel bad, first off, for his son, that his dad would be accused of a crime as horrific as this, but you also wonder just how often Pontello was at events where there were a lot of children. We also noticed on Facebook that the woman who Pontello identifies as being girlfriend on social media has a post from earlier this year that stood out to us. And that post read, quote, "Not every dude you expletive supposed to be around ya kids. I said what I said," end quote. It's unclear what she meant by that, but in the wake of these current events, it definitely caught our attention. Now, the attention of this story also needs to be on a victim, a young victim, someone who is so young. Deputies say that victim will have a long road ahead.
How is that 5-year-old child doing? I mean, that's a hard question.
I don't know. I don't know that we could answer that at this point. This could be,
This is a scar that, may never heal.
Pontello is being held on no bail. He is charged with rape, sex abuse, luring a child, and endangering the welfare of a child. Join us now to talk about this case is former sex crimes prosecutor Dan Shore. It's always great to have you on Law and Crime. This story, if you're a parent, is an absolute nightmare. What stands out to you with what this suspect is accused of?
Well, first of all, I've talked a lot on other episodes with you about how usually sexual misconduct involving children involves people you know, people you trust. It's rare to actually have a stranger just abduct someone. Usually it's the coach or a trusted relative or babysitter. And those are the people that parents really need to be careful about. But this really fits all the stereotypes with sexual misconduct that you see in the media that isn't as common as people think. But when it happens, it's horrifying that this 5-year-old was allegedly abducted by this defendant. And the charges are extremely serious, including forcible compulsion rape, which is the highest level of sex offense in New York. And so it's a very disturbing case.
Incredibly disturbing. I mean, you talk about some of the stereotypes even coming down to luring a child with candy, according to deputies. I feel like that's just something that you would see on Law and Order SVU, but not in reality. And unfortunately, that's what deputies say happened here. Dan, the suspect was a level 1 sex offender. What does that mean?
Sure. So there are 3 levels in New York. There's level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1 is the lowest. Level 3 is the highest. And usually it's based on the risk that people think the person will have of reoffending. And there's a lot of categories that you fill in information for to evaluate whether someone's a level 1, level 2, level 3, such as the age of the victim, whether weapons were involved, violence were involved, other factors about their background, and you get a number out of that. And if it's within a certain range, it's a level 1 offender. Higher range is level 2, and then the highest level is level 3. There's more restrictions if someone's a level 3 sex offender in terms of where they can live, where they can go. So level 1's the lowest, but it's still significant because you are a registered sex offender and you're in the registration database then.
And in the case of, I also think of where he lived. And that was, according to deputies, where this incident happened, somewhere near this apartment complex. Is that, if you're a level 1 sex offender, I mean, how much of a, could an apartment complex look and say you're a sex offender and then you're not allowed? What restrictions are there on where you live?
Sure. Usually it's based on the distance to a school or some other type of place that has a lot of children there. But this restrictions are less than if you were a level 3 sex offender. So it's a different category of being a sex offender, but it's still someone who does pose a risk according to the sex offender analysis, but it's the lowest level risk. So there won't be as many restrictions.
And he became a level 1 sex offender in 2013, and that was reportedly because of a plea deal related to a case in 2011 out of Oswego County, which is north of Syracuse, and we're still waiting for details on that. But typically, in your experience as a former sex crimes prosecutor, how much leverage, or I guess decision, how much can a prosecutor decide whether or not you want to give someone a plea deal, and what goes into that?
Well, the plea deal is usually based on the strength of the case, the seriousness of the case. A lot of times, especially with children, I don't know if a child was involved in the earlier one. We know a child was involved in this current one, but a lot of times when children are involved, you might be more likely to do a plea bargain because you don't want them to have to testify. On the other hand, though, those crimes are more egregious, so sometimes you need to go to trial in order to get a significant punishment for the defendant. But those are some of the categories. But then after there's a plea agreement, then usually there's the sex offender registration assessment where the prosecutor puts forward their analysis of what it should be. The defense puts their analysis forward, and then usually a judge is going to make the final decision about whether they're level 1, level 2, or level 3.
And for as, I mean, just heinous the allegations are in this story, for him to be a level 1 sex offender, I mean, how common is it for someone who has that lowest level designation to reoffend and allegedly do it to the level that he's doing it here?
Well, it definitely happens. And remember, someone who's a level 1 sex offender, they were convicted of a sex offense. So we don't know the specifics of what it was, but it is still significant. It's just not maybe including the aggravating factors of a level 2, level 3, which is maybe a more underage victim, maybe violence, factors like that. So they still can be very serious. And also, I know with sex offenders, I can't speak to this defendant particularly, but often there's an escalation in offenses over time. You hardly ever see someone who's never had a sex offense suddenly do something violent. Usually there's boundary probing and escalation, and maybe they get away with something and they escalate it from there. And that's one of the reasons why we have sex offender registration, to try to monitor people who have been convicted before they commit additional crimes. So it's not uncommon, unfortunately, for someone to escalate the type of behavior they engage in over time.
Unfortunately, you look at someone who might have some sort of restraining order on somebody, and it's really at the end of the day just a piece of paper. I mean, how can, even if you have oversight, even if you have someone that you're reporting to, how do you stop someone from going to a park in a public place where children are, even when the law says you shouldn't?
That's a great question. And it's really difficult. A lot of the mechanisms that are put in place in the law, you mentioned domestic violence, orders of protection, a lot of them are used for leverage the next time someone reoffends. So if someone violates an order of protection, the court has more leverage to incarcerate that person. Or if someone is on sex offender probation or they're a level 1 sex offender, there's a lot of monitoring, so you can restrict where they can live, make it harder for them to easily connect with children, but it doesn't make it impossible. And if someone's determined to do so, they're going to do it anyway. And that's why for some people, incarceration is the only way to stop them. But this society, once people are released, wants some way to monitor people, and the sex offender registration system is what has been created. It has helped a lot, but there's a lot of flaws in it.
Yeah, and in this case, Dan, I think too of just, this was someone, the suspect, not only accused of this case, deputies say he was also accused of a case involving someone he knew. She was 3 years old from the spring, and then you go back to the arrest that he had back more than a decade ago that got him that sex offender status. how likely is it that there could be other victims? I know deputies have said they're looking for that, but the idea that he would, 2013, more than a decade, and then suddenly be accused of this twice in just a matter of months.
Sure, that's something law enforcement has to look at. When I was a sex crimes prosecutor, we would always start to see if there are other victims out there. There's, as I said before, people who are sex offenders. Traditionally, that's been a type of crime where there's a lot of reoffending and repetitive nature to the conduct. So if these allegations are true and there's been a prior conviction, now maybe 2 new offenses, I would be very concerned about who else is out there who might have been hurt. And that's really important for law enforcement to reach out to find out about it, not just to prosecute him if he did it, but also to get services for the people who experienced it, because living with that trauma, especially as a child, without support help can be even more damaging to their lives than the offense itself.
Just seeing the ages of the alleged victims, it's just it hits you, and you did this job. I mean, I can't imagine how difficult it is in these cases. I mean, how do you, as a prosecutor, when you have victims who are so young, get their testimony in something like a criminal case down the line if this does go to trial?
Yeah, I did a lot of trials with sex abuse defendants with children. The youngest witness I ever had who was a victim was 7. So this child's 5. A child that young in New York isn't able to generally swear to tell the truth, but they could have unsworn testimony that could still be used in court. It's really difficult because a child that young, it may be hard to remember specific details, especially considering the trauma going into court and seeing the person who committed the offense. Sometimes they could do it from another room and there could be a camera. But it's extremely difficult for anyone. It's extremely difficult for adults, but then for a 5-year-old to have to go into court makes it very difficult. And a lot of times these cases go to some type of plea bargain because you want to avoid having the child testify. But the downside of that is then the defendant who might have committed an offense like this maybe gets off with less of a prison sentence because it was a plea bargain, not a trial. So there's no good answer here. It's a major challenge for law enforcement and sex crimes prosecutors.
I know that there are experts who are able to talk to young witnesses, young victims, like in this case, but can you take us inside? How do you interview a 5-year-old when you need to get this information for a case? How can you be trained to be able to do it so well and be able to emotionally just handle the conversation you're going to have with someone who was just a toddler a couple years ago?
Sure. And I was in those conversations with children. I led them, and there's a lot of parts to it. One is often it's good just to have an introductory meeting where you're not talking about the offense, but to get the person to know you, to trust you. It's good to have someone else present for that who the child does trust. So maybe it could be a parent or some other family member or trusted person, because it's going to be extremely upsetting possibly for someone to just be alone with a new stranger in a room after they've just experienced something like this. But hopefully you can talk to them, ask about what happened, make sure they're not in trouble, because a lot of kids will think, oh, I must be in trouble because I'm in this room with an authority figure asking me personal questions. Also, people are just brought up in any society. There's a lot of shame associated with someone having anything sexual thoughts or actions, especially when you're a child. And a lot of children interpret that to mean that they are in trouble. They did something wrong, and that stops them from reporting what really happened. So that's a major point to stress with children, that you didn't do anything wrong. Someone else did something wrong. It's okay to talk and to use either words or descriptions of things that in other contexts you're told, well, don't talk about that. Don't say that. That's a major point to get past as a prosecutor.
And kind of bring up a child and what they think, if they feel like they did anything wrong, when of course they didn't. But I also think of the rehabilitation for them, not just as a 5-year-old, but if there are memories that come back when you're 10 years old, 15 years old, I mean, the rest of your life. I mean, what type of resources are available for a young victim, not just when they're young, but lifelong?
Well, therapy is essential in a situation like this, because the trauma from something like this does not go away. It could last throughout someone's life, but certainly talking with a professional, which is different than talking with a prosecutor or the police, talking with some kind of counseling service that specializes in child sex abuse and really helping work through someone going through this process. And then another part of that is just trying to minimize the re-traumatization of the process, having to talk about it again, having to go into court. I always took child sex abuse victims into court before the trial, before they testified, showed them where they would be, where I would be, where their family might be sitting, where the defendant would be sitting and explain how this court officer is around so they can't hurt you. And, once you finish being questioned, you can leave. So really trying to minimize the re-traumatization, which there's going to be, unfortunately, going through this process.
Yeah, and you just think of these young victims, and of course he's innocent until proven guilty, but the prosecution seems to have a really strong case here. As far as when someone becomes a sex offender, and in this case, Syracuse.com reported that the local YMCA said he did not show up on their background check system because he was a member there. Typically, what can someone do? I guess if they're a sex offender, you're a level 1 sex offender. How uncommon is it that you wouldn't come up in a background check, that wouldn't be something that your gym or some other place, your apartment, I even think too, like where, how does that not come up in a background check?
Right. The big question for me that I would ask the company that did the background check is, did you search the sex offender registration database for this person? And if it sounds like they didn't, if it didn't come up, because it's not hard to search the database and find people's names. I don't know this company. I don't know what they did, but if he's a level 1 sex offender, he should come up in a quick search of the registration. So maybe that just wasn't part of the background check here, which is a problem. If you're trying to do background checks, that's a significant part of what you look at. You look at criminal records. You could also look at someone's social media to see if they're posting something dangerous. But certainly if someone's a sex offender, is a major thing to check when you're doing a background check like this.
And I know we've talked about a lot of stories, and many of them have involved teachers and people who are in positions of power who have taken advantage of young victims, and they've been in different states. I think we talked about one recently in Alabama, but in this case, it's New York. In your experience, how strict is the state of New York when it comes to prosecuting sex offenders and also recognizing whether they'll reoffend compared to other states that you've seen?
Well, certainly in terms of prosecuting, I think New York is very aggressive. It does change county by county because each county has their own DA's office. So some might be better than others, but I know that there's a lot of emphasis both in the law and in resources for counseling and services. There's a lot of organizations that support victims in New York State. And I think it's definitely a strong prosecution resource rich area, for at least it was when I was a prosecutor. But it can't catch everybody. And the second part of your question is about predicting when someone's going to reoffend. That's an age-old question that people wrestle with. How do you predict who's going to reoffend? How do you know what services or medication or incarceration for a short period of time will stop someone from reoffending? And society is grappling with that. It continues to grapple with that because we just don't know. We know that there's a lot of recidivism with sex offenders, but when you look at a specific person, part of the sex offender registration is measuring different categories to try to judge whether they're more likely to reoffend. Level 1 means that along with the categories that they measured, he was deemed more likely to reoffend, the most likely to reoffend if he was a level 1 sex offender. But it's not an exact science, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, it's it raises so many questions. And I'm sure when you have stories like this, you're going to have a lot of people on the outside look at the system and say that something needs to change. And no matter what the offense is, that someone should be put behind bars for a long period of time. In your experience for these offenders, certainly not in this case, because it appears that there has been a pattern going on here, but what's your thoughts on what punishment should be and how it should vary for people who have convicted some very, very heinous crimes?
Right. So the top count here is rape in the first degree based on forcible compulsion. That's a Class B felony in New York. You could face up to 25 years in prison for that. So if this defendant is guilty of that and they've offended in the past, I would expect them to get close to the maximum sentence there, because that's an aggravating factor. If the person's 5 years old, there was forcible compulsion used, and there was a prior sex offense. There might be other mitigating factors we don't know about, but it's hard to imagine any that would outweigh the factors that I just talked about.
Yeah, and so 20 years, I mean, because you look at, and I know there's another case we're waiting to learn more about out of New York as well, but in this case, 20 years would, based on what we know, the maximum if found guilty.
It'd be 25 years for rape in the first degree. Sometimes I'm looking at the other counts here, luring a child to commit a felony. Sometimes a judge can give consecutive time for other parts of the offenses. It's hard to know if a judge would do that, but the top count is a maximum of 25 years. So I would expect that if there's a conviction, certainly if there's a conviction at trial, I would expect the defendant to get the maximum or close to it based on the factors we know. Sometimes there's a more lenient sentence where there is a plea bargain. Most of that time that's done to spare the child having to testify. But I don't see anything that doesn't involve significant prison time if there is enough evidence to show that this defendant is guilty here.
And based if he's guilty of what the deputies in the area around Syracuse are saying that he committed, in your experience prosecuting these cases, I know you said you don't see stuff like this often. I mean, this one, in your opinion, really does stand out in terms of what he's accused of.
Absolutely. The fact that it was a stranger who lured someone away, the age of the victim just being 5 years old, the nature of the crime, rape in the first degree, forcible compulsion, that means there was some kind of penetration by force. That is the most serious sex offense that you can imagine, to have forcible compulsion of a 5-year-old by someone who lured them away. So that is going to be a much more harsh sentence, as it should be, than someone who inappropriately touches somebody, which is still a sex offense, still very serious. But for what this person's accused of, if the evidence can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, I would expect either the maximum or close to the maximum sentence.
Yeah, it's just, even talking about it, it's so difficult, as a parent, just to think about what this man is accused of. Dan, it's always great to have you on Law and Crime. I know you have a book coming out a short time from now. You have spent your career prosecuting these types of cases. What can people expect? I know your book's coming out in August.
Yeah, August 12th. It's my second novel. It's called Open Bar, and it's based on investigations of sex offenses of underage children. So a lot of the same topics that we've talked about on many episodes, I use my real world experience to talk about it in a more fictional sense. So it's called Open Bar. People could find it anywhere books are sold, or they could find me on Substack, where I have regular updates about these issues.
No, you have great perspective on these stories because they're really difficult to talk about. It's always great to have you, Dan Shore. Thanks for joining us on Law and Crime.
Well, thank you for covering this important story. It's always good to talk to you.
Prosecutors say they are expecting Pontello to be indicted on the charges he is facing at some point this week. Let me read those charges again for you. Rape, sex abuse, luring a child, and endangering the welfare of a child. We will continue to keep a close eye on this story, especially as deputies say they are looking to see if any more victims come forward. That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.